They found him buried in silence, curled like an unborn child, hidden beneath stone and soil for 7,000 years. His bones were not just bones, they were a message meant to sleep forever, until modern hands pried it open. You were never supposed to see this. No priest, no king, no scholar wanted you to know what was carved into the marrow of this forgotten skeleton, because it tells a story that dismantles the one you've been fed since birth. Look closer. His skull, cracked yet preserved, holds a secret that rewrites who we are. Beneath the soil of 1849, under the trembling Irish earth, they uncovered not just a man, but a forbidden lineage. His DNA, locked in the hardest stone of the human body, the petrous bone, survived every flood, every conquest, every empire that tried to erase him. And when scientists dissolved that ancient stone, when they sequenced the code of his being, they didn't find what they expected. They found a lie. This man did not belong to the narrative you were taught in school. His blood was not the blood of farmers who tilled the earth in innocence, nor the pale figures painted in textbooks. No. His genome whispered of a darker origin. He carried the fire of migrations from the east, from the Pontic Steppe, the same plains that birthed nomads, raiders, warlords. He was not meant to be gentle. He was meant to conquer. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. His skin was dark, almost black. His hair thick. His eyes, impossibly blue. A genetic combination that does not exist in our world anymore. A forgotten phenotype. A human design erased from the earth, not by chance, but by force. Imagine it. A people who looked nothing like us, yet carried a light in their eyes that burned against the void. What happened to them? Why are they gone? You're beginning to sense it now. This isn't just archaeology. This isn't just history. This is the opening of a vault that was sealed shut by those who write the myths of civilization. They never wanted you to see this man. They never wanted you to ask why his people disappeared, because if you knew, you would start to wonder what else was buried. And once you wonder, you can't go back. The summer heat in Ohio that year was unlike any other. The air hung heavy, thick with moisture and the faint metallic tang of storms brewing far in the distance. Crops withered under the oppressive sun, and livestock stirred restlessly as though some unseen hand had unsettled them. Farmers across the valley muttered about curses, but Tobias Hale ignored such talk. He was a man of the earth, hardened by years of toil, with calloused hands that trusted only the weight of his shovel and the soil beneath his boots. But something in his land had shifted. It began as a faint murmur beneath the ground, a vibration so subtle it seemed like the memory of thunder. Tobias first noticed it while tilling the farthest edge of his property, near the stretch of woods his father had warned him never to disturb. At first he dismissed it as exhaustion, the ringing of blood in his ears. Yet, night after night, when the fields grew silent and even the crickets ceased their song, the whispers returned. Neighbors whispered too, though not about soil. They spoke of Tobias's solitary nature, of how he rarely came to church, how his eyes seemed to linger on the earth as if waiting for it to answer him. A widow claimed she heard him speaking aloud in the fields to no one. Another said she saw him dig at midnight with only a lantern, his figure hunched and feverish. The soil, it seemed, had become his only companion. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Tobias struck something unusual with his spade. It wasn't rock or clay. It was softer, almost fleshy, with a dark stain that seeped into the dirt. The smell was sharp, iron-rich, unmistakable. Blood. His shovel came up wet, and the ground beneath him seemed to exhale, a hot breath of decay and something older, something that did not belong to men. From that day, the whispers grew louder, no longer faint. They carried words Toby, as could almost understand, voices pressing against his skull like roots seeking water. They called his name, they begged, they commanded, they promised. The other farmers had fields of corn and wheat. Tobias Hale had a field of voices. The voices would not let him rest. By the end of July, Tobias Hale had stopped sleeping altogether. He would lie in his bed, staring at the cracked beams of the ceiling as whispers crawled up from the floorboards beneath him. Some were soft, like prayers murmured through walls. Others were shrill, almost desperate, as though they clawed for his attention. On the first night he gave in, Tobias rose before midnight, lantern in hand, shovel over his shoulder, and walked barefoot into the field. The air was thick and damp, carrying the scent of something metallic. The lantern's glow carved a trembling circle of light as he planted the shovel into the ground. The soil parted too easily, as if it had been waiting. Every strike of the blade brought new voices. They overlapped. Men, women, even children, each speaking in a tongue Tobias did not recognize yet somehow understood. They spoke of hunger, of chains, of betrayal. Some wept, others laughed in jagged, broken tones. The sound was not carried by the wind, but seemed to come from inside the earth itself, as if the soil were breathing words. At 3 feet down, the dirt changed. No longer brown and dry, it was dark, damp, and clung to his hands like clotted blood. A worm surfaced, but it was pale, nearly translucent, writhing unnaturally fast before retreating back into the wound he had made in the ground. Then came the first object. His shovel scraped something solid, wooden, rotted, but unmistakably shaped. Tobias fell to his knees and clawed with his bare hands until he unearthed the corner of a small box, blackened with age and dampness. The whispers surged, pressing against his skull, urging him to open it. His chest heaved with both terror and exhilaration as he pried at the brittle wood. Inside was a bundle of cloth, decayed and eaten away by time. Nestled within it was a length of bone, human, small, like that of a child's forearm. The whispers stopped. For the first time in weeks there was silence. But the silence was worse. For silence meant listening. And in the stillness of that midnight hour, Tobias realized the earth beneath him was not filled with bones of one child or even one body. It was filled with hundreds. And they had only just begun to notice him. The night after Tobias unearthed the child's bone, he swore he would never touch the shovel again. He buried the box where he found it, stomped the earth flat, and staggered back to his house with trembling hands. But the soil did not forgive him. It never forgave those who disturbed it. That night, the whispers returned, louder, clearer, and no longer scattered nonsense. They spoke in unison now, a choir of buried voices rising through his floorboards, filling his home with their dreadful harmony. His lantern flickered, as if the air itself bent to their rhythm. Tobias pressed his palms over his ears, but the voices clawed their way into his skull. Deeper, they hissed. Bring us up, and we will give you what you seek. What do I seek? Tobias shouted into the empty cabin, his voice raw, his eyes wild. Strength, wealth, protection from death. You need only keep digging. Tobias fell to his knees, choking on a fear that felt like it had its own weight. His father had warned him about the woods, about the ground that bled. He remembered the old man's words. Boy, the land remembers more than men. Don't wake what's been buried. But Tobias was poor. His crops were failing, his debts mounting. He had nothing but the earth beneath him, and now it spoke of power. For 3 nights he resisted, locking the shovel in the barn, stuffing rags in his ears, praying louder than he ever had before. But the whispers knew his weakness. They spoke to him of gold veins beneath the soil, of hidden relics, of secrets only he could uncover. They whispered of neighbors who mocked him, who doubted him, men whose fields thrived while his withered. They promised him vengeance, promised him a name that would outlive the valley itself. On the 4th night, Tobias broke. He tore the shovel free from its lock and trudged barefoot into the field. The moon was high, white as bone, and the earth seemed to quake in anticipation. When the first shovelful of dirt rose into the air, the voices cheered, not with joy but with hunger. It was not Tobias who dug that night. It was the bargain he had accepted, and bargains with the earth never came without a cost. The deeper Tobias dug, the stranger the ground became. The soil no longer smelled of earth and roots, but of iron, mold, and something rancid, as though rot itself had seeped into every grain. His lantern cast long shadows across the pit, and in those shadows Tobias swore he saw movement, limbs twitching, jaws opening, sockets watching. Yet when he blinked, there was only dirt. By the 5th night of digging, the pit had widened into a wound upon his land. What should have been solid Ohio clay gave way too easily, crumbling like ash, as though the earth wanted to be opened. His shovel struck objects again and again, wooden fragments, shards of pottery, rusted iron chains. And then came the bones. At first he uncovered a rib cage, curved like the frame of a broken cradle. Then a jawbone, teeth still locked in a silent scream. Then dozens more spilling into the pit as if the ground itself was spitting them out. Men, women, children, a graveyard vast enough to swallow an army. The voices rose in ecstasy. "You have found us. You have freed us." Tobias staggered back, dropping the lantern into the pit. For a moment its flame illuminated the sheer enormity of what lay beneath, layers upon layers of skeletal remains, stacked like grain in a silo, stretching into blackness no light could touch. The pit did not have a bottom. It had a hunger. His mind raced with questions he dared not form. Who had buried them? When? Why had no farmer before him struck this cursed vein of death? As he knelt at the edge, the whispers pressed closer, sliding into him like smoke through cracks in a wall. They no longer sounded like strangers. Some of them carried his mother's voice, his father's, the laughter of children he had known as a boy. They spoke with the voices of his blood, though he knew they had long been dead and buried elsewhere. "Stay with us, Tobias. Dig deeper, and you will never be alone. Dig deeper, and we will give you what the living never could." For the first time in his life, Tobias Hale wept openly. He wept not from sorrow, but from the dreadful realization that he wanted to believe them. The pit waited. The bones gleamed. The bargain was no longer a question. It was an inheritance. By August, the whispers were no longer confined to the Hale farm. They leaked. Children walking home from the schoolhouse claimed they heard crying in the wind when they passed Tobias's fields. A farmhand from a neighboring plot swore he saw lantern light at 3 a.m, shadows moving like a congregation gathered around a single man digging, and an old widow whose house faced the valley told anyone who would listen that sometimes, just before dawn, she could see Tobias standing in the pit, arms outstretched, as if preaching to the earth itself. The townsfolk grew uneasy. Farmers who once nodded to Tobias at market now kept their distance. Whispers passed over barrels of apples and sacks of grain. He struck something unholy. Always was a strange one. His father warned us about that land. I heard him talking to voices, clear as you and me, but there wasn't a soul around. Tobias noticed. He saw the way they looked at him, but he no longer cared. He was leaner now, skin pulled tight over his bones, eyes burning with sleepless fervor. His hands were raw, nails cracked and caked with black soil, yet he carried himself with a strange pride, as though the secret beneath his fields had set him apart from mortal men. And perhaps it had. For the more he dug, the more the voices rewarded him. His fields, once dry and failing, began to stir with unnatural growth. Corn shot up green and tall even without rain, as if drinking something richer than water. Ailing livestock that should have perished in the heat stood strong again, their eyes glinting with an odd, unnatural sheen. But the neighbors only saw the surface, the crops, the animals, Tobias's strange glow of vitality. They could not see what he heard at night, the endless chorus beneath the earth, whispering his name, teaching him words not meant for human tongues. The whispers told him the town did not serve him. They told him the land was his alone, and they promised him that soon, very soon, all the valley would kneel at the edge of his pit and listen, and Tobias Hale believed them. The bargain had been struck, but bargains always demand proof. One night in late August, the voices changed. They no longer whispered of riches or strength. They whispered of hunger, a collective gnawing that filled Tobias's skull until he staggered from his bed and clawed at his ears. "You have taken from us. You have fed from our soil. Now feed us." Tobias stumbled into the fields, lantern swaying, eyes fevered. The corn swayed though there was no wind, the stalks rattling like bones knocking together. The earth beneath him pulsed. He could feel it, like the steady beat of a heart buried deep below. At the edge of the field stood a calf, born weak and lame. Tobias had kept it alive out of pity, though it was of no use. Now, as the voices pressed into his mind, he understood why he had spared it. His hands shook as he led the calf toward the pit. It stumbled, bleated softly, and looked up at him with liquid brown eyes. "Do it, Tobias," the earth hissed. "Show us your devotion." He hesitated only once, but then he remembered the failing crops, the debts, the sneers of neighbors. He remembered the promises, power, wealth, protection from death. His resolve hardened. With a single brutal motion, Tobias slit the calf's throat and let its blood spill into the pit. The ground drank greedily, the soil hissing as the dark liquid sank into it. For a moment there was silence. Then the whispers erupted, not in hunger, but in ecstasy. They howled like 1,000 voices freed from chains, rattling through his skull until his knees buckled. The calf's body was gone by morning. Nothing remained. No bones, no hide, no trace it had ever existed. But in its place, Tobias found something else. Sprouting at the edge of the pit was a stalk unlike any he had seen, black as coal, its leaves veined with crimson, its tassels dripping something too thick to be dew. He touched it and whined. Warmth pulsed beneath its skin, like touching living flesh. The voices whispered softly, almost tender now. "You have begun. Now the earth is truly yours." Tobias Hale stood over the pit, with blood still on his hands, and realized he was no longer a farmer. He was a servant. And servants must obey. By September, whispers had escaped the boundaries of Tobias's fields and entered the ears of the entire valley. Livestock began disappearing one by one. Cows vanished from their pens without a trace. Sheep and pigs alike gone by morning. The townsfolk whispered rumors of wolves, though no tracks were ever found. Birds circled the Hale farm in unusual patterns, crying long and low, as if mourning or warning. Neighbors began to talk in corners. Windows shuttered early. Children were kept inside after dusk. Old men spoke of curses long buried beneath Ohio soil, of spirits that devoured the unwary. Tobias did not hide. He watched them whispering across fence lines, heard them naming him with fear. But he no longer felt shame or caution. The pit had marked him, changed him. The crops, though, flourished unnaturally. Corn, squash, and barley sprouted thick and black-veined, bending under their own strange weight. The livestock that remained were unnaturally strong, their coats glossy as if polished by some unseen hand. Tobias's neighbors could not deny his success, but fear lingered in every glance, every hushed word. Even the wind seemed to bend around his property, carrying low moans that could not be explained away as nature. Dogs whimpered when they neared the boundary. One evening, old man Harlan, whose farm bordered Tobias's, ventured too close to the fields and vanished. His lantern was found on the edge of the pit, bloodless and untouched, as if he had simply been swallowed by the night. The whispers came to Tobias more frequently now, sometimes in the voices of his neighbors. "We see you. You serve well. We hunger still." They spoke of secrets in the soil, of relics and bones, of power waiting to be claimed. They told him that the valley itself belonged to him now, and that the living were only visitors. And Tobias began to believe it. The town's unease grew to outright panic. Families packed small wagons in the dead of night, fleeing roads that led past the Hale farm. But many remained, drawn by curiosity, by superstition, or by stubbornness. Those who stayed whispered of hearing Tobias speak to shadows in the moonlight, moving among the black-veined crops like a priest tending an altar that pulsed with life. No one knew the truth of the pit, of the voices, of the bargains made in blood and soil. Only Tobias and the earth below understood the depth of the change, and as the town's suspicion festered, the whispers promised him something darker still. Soon they will come to kneel. Soon all will witness. And Tobias waited, knowing that the reckoning was inevitable, and that nothing in the valley would ever be the same. It was on a night thick with fog that Tobias felt the earth beneath his feet shiver. The whispers had grown insistent, relentless, pulling him toward the southern edge of the pit, where the soil was softest, almost molten in its texture. His lantern flickered violently, as if warning him to stop, but Tobias did not. He had learned that fear was a tool, one he now wielded better than any neighbor could. With each shovel of soil removed, the pit widened into a cavern, walls damp and glistening like wet stone. Then, at last, his shovel struck something different. Not dirt, not bone, not the black-veined roots that had begun to infest the crops. Cold, smooth stone, carved with symbols that twisted and coiled like snakes. Tobias knelt, brushing away soil to reveal an entrance, a portal to something older than any record in the valley. The air that escaped was fetid, rich with iron and decay, yet it carried a strange sweetness beneath it, like the perfume of something forbidden yet sacred. The whispers rose to a chorus now, urgent and demanding. Enter, see what was hidden, know what must be claimed. Tobias hesitated only a moment. He lit a torch, the flame wavering against the thick darkness, and stepped through the stone archway. Inside, the chamber stretched farther than his eyes could measure. Shadows clung to the walls like living things. Ancient bones were stacked with meticulous care, some gnawed and weathered, others polished as though ritualized. And in the very center of the chamber, half buried in soil, lay a coffin not made of wood, but of some black, glimmering stone Tobias did not recognize. Etchings crawled across its surface, spirals, twisted figures, glyphs that seemed to move when stared at too long. He reached out, fingers trembling, and the whispers turned urgent. Open it. Know the truth. Take the gift. When Tobias touched the coffin, though, the air shifted. A vibration ran through the chamber, low and deep like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The whispers changed, becoming many voices layered atop one another, human and not, male and female, old and child, chanting in a language Tobias had never heard yet understood. It was then he realized the chamber was not merely a tomb, it was a library of souls. Each skeleton, each bone, each whisper carried knowledge, memory, and power, preserved for millennia beneath the soil. The pit had been a gateway, the sacrifice a key, and now Tobias stood at the threshold of a secret the world was never meant to know. And the chamber waited. It waited for him to claim it. The chamber breathed. Tobias could feel it in his bones, a slow exhalation that rattled the stones and made his teeth chatter. Then a voice, not one but a multitude merging into one, spoke directly into his mind. It was low, resonant, and ancient, vibrating in his skull as if bypassing ears altogether. Tobias Hale, we have waited. He staggered, clutching his torch, his heart hammering so violently it threatened to shatter his ribs. The air thickened, pressing against his chest like the weight of centuries. The voices spoke again, this time slower, deliberate. You dug where man was not meant to dig. You fed where man was not meant to feed. You are chosen. A shiver ran down Tobias's spine. The whispers carried knowledge, not hints, not riddles, but vivid clarity. He saw images flash in his mind, civilizations buried beneath ash, priests offering blood to stone altars, rulers who commanded with voices borrowed from the earth itself. He saw their power, their triumphs, and their ultimate undoing. You must learn. You must obey. You must become the vessel. The chamber pulsed with a rhythm like a heartbeat, deep and inexorable. Tobias fell to his knees. The whispers were now caressing, persuasive, seductive. They promised him insight that no mortal scholar could grasp. Power that could bend life and death, and a dominion over the valley beyond imagination. And yet, with the promise came a warning. There is a cost. Every gift demands blood. Every revelation demands obedience. Fail, and the earth will claim you. Tobias's mind raced. Fear warred with exhilaration, but the voices quelled it, drenching him in a sense of inevitability. He understood. This was not mere survival, it was transformation. He could feel the pit beneath him, the blood of the first sacrifice still lingering in the soil, connecting him to something older, deeper, and more dangerous than any hue. Man-law. The air shimmered. Shadows in the chamber twisted toward him, pulling him closer to the black stone coffin at the center. He could see shapes moving within it. Figures, skeletal hands, eyes that glimmered with knowledge, long extinguished. And then, softly, a phrase repeated. Rise as we rose, speak as we spoke, learn as we endured. Tobias understood the truth. To wield this power was to surrender fully, to let the voices in, to bind his will to theirs, to become more than human and yet less than mortal. And in that instant, he knew there was no turning back. The chamber waited, Tobias Hale waited, and the first true pact of blood and knowledge was sealed in silence. Tobias awoke the next morning feeling as if he had never truly slept. The chamber's influence had seeped into his body while he lay in its darkness. His fingers twitched involuntarily, his vision sharper, and the air around him seemed charged, humming with unseen energy. It was subtle at first, a heightened awareness of the soil beneath his feet, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the heartbeat of the valley itself. By noon, the changes became undeniable. His strength had increased. The muscles in his arms and back ached as if finally awakened from years of dormancy, his reflexes sharp enough to catch a falling axe mid-swing. But it was not merely physical. Tobias could hear the whispers now without closing his eyes, voices in the wind, in the cattle, in the stones of his fields. They guided him, coaxed him, instructed him. Touch the soil, it remembers. Speak, and it obeys. He tested it, pressing his palms to the blackened earth near the pit. A vine, twisted and glistening like sinew, responded, crawling upward at a speed no natural plant could achieve. He recoiled at first, a thrill of terror shooting through him, but then fascination replaced fear. He had become something new, a conduit for a power older than any living thing in the valley. Yet transformation demanded more than obedience, it demanded ritual. Tobias returned nightly to the chamber, performing tasks the voices dictated. Each act, placing stones in precise patterns, offering small sacrifices, whispering incantations in the ancient tongue, awakened the chamber further. Shadows shifted on the walls, not randomly, but in shapes that suggested intention, sentience, a living consciousness waiting for the right vessel to wield it. The townsfolk noticed the change in Tobias too. He no longer flinched at their whispers or their fearful glances. His presence alone silenced disputes, commanded attention. Child. Wren ran from his path, dogs howled as he passed, and yet crops thrived in his shadow, as if the valley itself acknowledged his dominion. The whispers, however, were not without demand. Each night their urgency escalated, their tone sharper, more insistent. Blood binds, knowledge feeds, power awakens, obey, or be unmade. Tobias began to see visions, glimpses of the chamber's previous claimants, figures twisted and contorted in the shadows, faces half hidden behind skeletal masks, eyes burning with a fire that had not yet been extinguished. They were both warning and instruction. He realized that every human who sought this power had been tested, some had failed, and some had become part of the chamber's consciousness itself. By the end of the first week, Tobias knew he was no longer merely a man. He was something more, and something older. And the voices promised him, with chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. By the second week, the valley itself began to reflect Tobias's transformation. The crops twisted unnaturally, black veins running through their stems and leaves, growing faster than any human labor could account for. Livestock that remained on his property moved with uncanny precision, avoiding harm, almost as if understanding him. The whispers told him that the valley was responding, that it recognized its new master. He walked along the ridges of his fields at dawn and noticed the wind itself bending around him, carrying his presence farther than his voice could reach. Birds of every kind circled his lands, not to flee, but to observe, their cries eerily synchronized. Even the river, sluggish and mundane before, now seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Tobias had become a conductor, and the valley his orchestra. Yet with the power came unease. Strange phenomena began to manifest, shadows moving independently of their objects, whispers emanating from stones and soil, and dreams, terrible, lucid visions of previous mortals who had attempted the chamber's secrets. They appeared, warning him of the cost, showing him distorted reflections of what might happen if he failed the chamber's demands. Do you see what lies beneath the veil? Do you understand what must be sacrificed? The voices pressed, insistent, guiding his hands and shaping his mind. Tobias began to perform rituals on a larger scale. He dug trenches that glowed faintly under moonlight, planted seeds in precise geometric patterns, and marked symbols around his fields, each act feeding the chamber's consciousness deeper into the valley itself. The townsfolk could no longer ignore the changes. Smoke spiraled unnaturally from his chimneys. The air carried a scent both metallic and sweet, and animals avoided his lands as if instinctively aware of a forbidden power. Some brave souls tried to confront him, but Tobias, standing tall with eyes glimmering like fire-lit glass, silenced them with a mere gesture. Fear had become his ally, obedience secondary to the primal recognition of his authority. And the whispers spoke of more. Soon, the valley will no longer belong to man alone. It will obey its master, and its master will be remembered beyond time. Tobias understood. The valley was no longer a simple patch of Ohio land. It had become a living extension of the chamber, an entity shaped and molded by the ancient consciousness he now served. Every plant, every stone, every river bend became a part of a ritual older than any human memory. He had not merely unearthed power, he had awakened the valley itself. And the valley waited, patient and hungry, for the next command. One night, as a storm rolled over the horizon, Tobias felt the first true tremor of danger. The whispers had grown agitated, overlapping in a chaotic crescendo that rattled the chamber within him. Their tone was no longer seductive. It was sharp, urgent, laced with dread. They come. Outsiders. They seek what is ours. They will not understand. They will take. They will destroy. Tobias's pulse quickened. Outside, the valley moaned under the wind's assault. The trees bent unnaturally, their branches clawing at the sky, and the river churned as though alive, responding to the unseen threat. Tobias lit torches along the perimeter of his lands, the flames flickering violently, yet no ordinary man could have interpreted the symbols the wind now carried. The valley itself was speaking, warning him, preparing him. The chamber's voices instructed him to act, to bind the valley tighter to his will. Tobias followed their directions with methodical precision, carving sigils into stone, placing offerings at the riverbanks, even manipulating the storm itself, feeling the lightning and thunder respond to his concentration. The air became thick, charged, almost tangible, a storm wrought from more than clouds, an extension of the chamber's wrath. Then came the first sighting. A group of strangers, foolish in their confidence, crested the ridge at dawn, oblivious to the subtle distortions in the land that should have warned them away. Tobias observed them from the shadows. They were scholars, local men who believed they could uncover the truth of his lands, the strange phenomena the townsfolk whispered about, but they were unprepared for what lay beyond mere superstition. The whispers now spoke as one, cold and commanding. They are intruders. They cannot see, they cannot comprehend. You must show them the depth of what has awakened. Tobias's hands moved almost automatically too, racing symbols into the soil, summoning unseen forces. The ground beneath the scholars trembled, stones shifted subtly beneath their feet, birds erupted into the sky, crying in alarm, and the wind carried a low, unintelligible chant that made the intruders falter. Panic spread through their ranks like wildfire. They could not understand what they faced, only that something ancient and wrong was awake. Tobias stepped from the shadows, his eyes reflecting the storm and the chamber's power. He spoke, voice low, resonant, each word heavy with authority. You are not meant to be here. Leave, or you will become part of what you seek. The men froze. Fear, raw and primal, gripped them. Some fled, stumbling, tripping into the valley's strange bending paths. Others could not resist the allure of the dark, hidden knowledge the valley radiated. Tobias's lips curved slightly. The first warning had been delivered, and the valley waited, patient. The valley had changed irrevocably. Tobias could feel it now, not merely in the wind, in the soil, or in the whispering trees, but deep within his own body, coursing like a pulse that matched the land itself. It was no longer enough to manipulate crops, rivers, or animals. His connection demanded more. The chamber, ever insistent, had made its requirements clear. Power must be fed, and power must be anchored in blood. He spent the night preparing. The chamber whispered precise instructions, guiding his hands to carve a symbol into the cold stone floor of the pit. It was intricate, a pattern no human could memorize in a single glance. But Tobias traced it carefully, each line exact, each curve deliberate. The stone beneath his fingers seemed to hum as he worked, resonating with the echo of centuries of ancient energy buried in the earth. The chamber's consciousness was awakening fully, coiling through the valley like a living thing, and Tobias understood that tonight the bond would be sealed. By dawn, Tobias had chosen the offering, not out of cruelty, but necessity. The valley had grown restless, its hunger undeniable. He caught a young goat, a creature of pure instinct and vitality, and brought it to the carved stone. The animal trembled, sensing the unnatural power suffusing the air. Tobias's hands were steady. He had rehearsed this in his mind countless times, preparing for the exact moment when obedience to the chamber outweighed personal morality. The whispers guided him, soft and commanding, instructing him in the cadence of the ritual, the precise words to utter. Blood binds, life flows, power awakens. The first incision was careful, deliberate. The goat's life pulsed through Tobias's fingers, the rhythm of its heartbeat synchronizing with the vibrations of the valley. As the blood spilled over the carved sigils, the ground seemed to drink it, absorbing too. He energy with a slow, almost sentient suction. The chamber hummed with approval, a resonance that shook Tobias to his core. The valley responded immediately, the wind stilled, the birds fell silent, and the river's current slowed as if paying homage. The trees leaned inward, their branches brushing together to create a canopy that felt like a cathedral, sacred and terrifying. As he completed the offering, the whispers intensified, no longer soft, no longer indirect. They filled his mind completely. He heard the names of all who had touched the chamber before him, felt the echo of their attempts, their triumphs, their failures. The valley itself had become a memory, a record of all who had lived and died within its influence. Tobias was no longer merely a man wielding power. He was its vessel, its master, and its first true priest in centuries. The effect was immediate and irreversible. Plants around the ritual glowed faintly under the morning sun, veins darkened like ink in the leaves. Animals, even those far from the pit, responded to his presence with unnatural precision. Tobias realized then that he could manipulate life itself, compel obedience from the world, bend nature to the will of the chamber. But even as triumph surged through him, the whispers warned this was only the beginning. Greater offerings would be required, more intricate rituals, more life. Tobias's moral certainty had fractured, replaced by the singular awareness of what he had become, the chosen conduit of something older, hungrier, and more terrifying than any human imagination could contain. He looked over the valley, now fully alive, quivering under the unseen energy he commanded, and understood that the line between mastery and obsession had already blurred. The valley was his, the chamber had chosen him, and now life itself would bow to their will. Tobias awoke before dawn, his body still humming from the first blood offering. The valley around him was quiet, yet alive in a way that made the hairs on his neck rise. He could feel the pulse of something immense beneath the soil, a rhythm older than human memory. But this morning there was something new, a presence, not of the wind, not of the river, but of minds long dead, lingering like smoke in the corners of his consciousness. The chamber had begun to speak more clearly, its voice layered, containing not just instructions, but history. These were not mere whispers, they were echoes of every human who had touched the chamber before him, whose ambition, desperation, or folly had bound them to the land. Tobias could feel their anger, their regret, their hunger. They were shadows now, merging with him, testing him, demanding obedience even as they amplified his own power. He walked through the valley, each step heavy with awareness. Stones shifted underfoot. Rivers and streams responded to his presence with subtle currents and ripples, as if greeting a returning master. And all the while the shadows whispered secrets, how to draw power from the soil, how to bend the river's flow, how to make the wind carry not just messages, but fear. Tobias realized that the chamber was not just a source of power, it was a library of human ambition, a vault of souls, and he was now its curator. But with knowledge came unease. The shadows did not merely instruct, they argued, questioned, reminded him of the cost. Do you understand what comes after this? Do you understand who you may become if you fail? The voices were not hostile, but their weight was suffocating. Tobias had to steel his mind against them, weaving his own will around theirs, claiming dominion without losing himself entirely. The valley responded, trees twisted in impossible angles, their roots weaving across paths that had been straight for centuries. Animals fled, yet some stayed, their eyes reflecting intelligence that defied natural law. Tobias sensed the boundary between life and death blurring, the line between himself and the shadows thinning. They guided him toward ancient stone formations at the heart of the valley, monuments older than the chamber itself, etched with patterns that seemed to vibrate with energy. He realized then that these monuments were not mere markers, they were conduits. They pulsed with the energy of those who had been bound before him, and Tobias felt the first true surge of communion. The shadows lent him strength, teaching him the rhythm of ancient power, allowing him to manipulate reality in subtle, terrifying ways. But every gift carried a cost. His humanity was eroding, replaced by something sharper, colder, more deliberate. And yet, he welcomed it. Tobias had glimpsed the true nature of the chamber. Not a tool, not a source of wealth, but a force that could transform a man into something beyond mortality, something feared and revered. He could feel the valley bending further under his will, the shadows merging ever closer, whispering, "You are not alone, you are the next, and yet we are all one. Control the valley, master the chamber, or be consumed by the weight of those who came before." Tobias smiled faintly. Fear was no longer his enemy. It was a guide, sharpening him, binding him to power he could never release. The shadows of the ancients were no longer voices. They were part of him, and through them the valley itself had become his instrument. The valley waited, patient, ready for the next act. The valley had grown darker, not from the absence of light, but from the weight of awareness pressing against it. Tobias could feel it, a tension in the soil, in the wind, even in the very stones beneath his feet. He had become the pulse of the land, and yet the valley's heartbeat now throbbed with an unfamiliar rhythm. The presence of outsiders. They arrived quietly at first, small figures on the ridges, moving with deliberate care. Scholars, treasure hunters, perhaps even skeptics, seeking proof of the stories whispered by the townsfolk. They believed the valley a mere legend, a story to thrill the gullible. They had no idea that every tree, every rock, every shadow belonged to Tobias and the chamber that pulsed through him like a living organism. The whispers intensified, chaotic now, layered with the voices of the ancients. They do not belong. They do not understand. They must not take what is ours. Tobias's hands itched with anticipation, his mind already tracing the patterns of influence. The chamber had not merely given him power, it had taught him control over perception, over fear, over the instinct of those who trespassed. He watched the outsiders descend into the valley, confident and naive. Tobias could feel the way the land responded to their presence, twigs snapping in unnatural patterns, shadows stretching longer than they should, whispers curling around their minds in incomprehensible murmurs. Birds lifted in unison, startled, their cries like alarms that humans could barely hear. The valley was alive, and it recognized the intruders as prey. One man, bolder than the others, stepped onto the stones Tobias had carved into the soil, the sigils still faintly glowing from the first offering. Tobias felt the power surge through him in response. He closed his eyes and allowed the chamber and the shadows to guide him, pulling at the threads of reality. He ground beneath the man, trembled subtly, rocks shifting beneath his feet. The wind whispered his deepest fears, and though he did not understand, his heart faltered. The outsiders began to sense it, a wrongness in the air, a weight pressing down on their minds. Some turned back instinctively, unease curling in their guts like ice, while others pressed forward, compelled by curiosity and arrogance. Tobias smiled inwardly. The chamber had taught him more than manipulation of matter. It had taught him manipulation of psyche. He could bend their attention, distort their perception, make them see what should not be seen. And then he let the first wave of fear fully loose. Shadows flared, low mists rising from the soil to obscure the valley's paths. A subtle tremor shifted the trees, making them seem to lean toward the intruders, fingers of bark reaching for flesh. The outsiders froze, panic spreading like wildfire through their group. One stumbled into a root and fell, his scream cut short by the valley's unnatural silence. Tobias's voice, low and commanding, carried across the mist. "You should not have come here. Leave, or you will join the echoes of those who came before." The shadows of the ancients stirred behind him, leaning into his power, lending him centuries of knowledge and malice. The outsiders hesitated, caught between disbelief and a primal terror they could not name. In that moment, Tobias understood the truth of the chamber. It did not merely amplify power. It demanded mastery, demanded dominance, and punished weakness with a cruelty older than memory. And tonight, the valley would teach that lesson in full. The outsiders had thought themselves prepared. They had maps, tools, cameras, journals filled with skepticism and hubris. But the valley had no need for their instruments, their knowledge, or their arrogance. Tobias stood at its heart, the pulse of the chamber coursing through him, his mind linked to the ancient consciousness of those who had walked this land long before any human had dared to chart it. The valley moved, trees bent unnaturally, their roots surfacing to trip, to ensnare. The wind rose in irregular gusts, carrying whispers that shredded reason. Rocks shifted subtly beneath the intruders' feet, creating micro-landslides that went unnoticed until it was too late. Every step they took was anticipated, every action mirrored and countered by the valley itself, acting not as terrain, but as predator. Tobias's control was complete, his mastery absolute. He extended his awareness, letting the shadows of the ancients pour into the present. They twisted the perception of the intruders. One saw the ground open into a chasm, another felt invisible hands tug at their clothes, their skin crawling with fear of something they could not define. Their rational minds clung desperately to the idea of coincidence until the mists rose and obscured the familiar, transforming the valley into a labyrinth of living stone and murmuring air. The first casualty came silently. A man tried to run, but the roots beneath his feet seemed to constrict, tripping him and throwing him into a shallow ravine. His scream echoed, distorted by the valley, bouncing from tree to rock, growing longer, stranger, impossible. Others turned, confusion blending with panic as Tobias wove the fear into a tangible force, a weapon that pressed on the chest, twisted the stomach, and gnawed at the mind. And yet Tobias did not strike with violence alone. The chamber demanded more than destruction. It demanded transformation. Each intruder was shown visions of the valley's ancient masters, the faces of those who had failed, the blood sacrifices, the warnings, the knowledge that power could be claimed, but at a cost beyond comprehension. Their minds, unprepared for this immersion, began to fracture. Rational thought became a fragile shell. Instinct and terror guided their bodies. Tobias walked among them, unseen yet omnipresent. He could hear their hearts, their shallow breaths, their desperation. A whisper from the chamber suggested the next stage, to reveal the choice they had never known existed. He extended his voice into their consciousness, not in words, but in meaning, a single, clear impression: submit or be consumed. Some fell to their knees, shaking, tears streaming, eyes wide as if seeing the valley's true face for the first time. Others tried to flee, but the shadows followed, twisting around them, compressing the air with dread. Tobias felt the thrill of absolute control, the intoxicating rush of bending reality through will alone. And as the final scream echoed and faded into the valley's depths, he understood the most chilling truth. This power was limitless, but only for the one willing to surrender entirely to the valley and to the chamber's insatiable will. The outsiders were gone, some broken, some forever lost to the whispers of the land. Tobias remained, chest heaving, mind ablaze, the valley thrumming beneath him as if acknowledging its new master. The chamber had not merely empowered him, it had revealed the hierarchy of existence itself. Those who controlled fear controlled reality. Those who bowed to nothing but ambition survived. And Tobias knew, with a cold certainty, that this was only the beginning. After the outsiders had vanished, the valley fell into an eerie stillness, but Tobias knew that stillness was an illusion. The chamber's pulse continued, a deep, resonant thrum that filled every corner of the valley and reverberated within his own skull. At first it was subtle, faint whispers, half-formed thoughts that were not entirely his own, but gradually he began to realize the truth. The chamber was not separate from him. It was inside him, and he was inside it. The whispers became clearer, sharper, more insistent. They were not voices of the past alone. They were strategies, admonitions, memories, and urgencies that seemed to anticipate his every move. Tobias could feel the ancient consciousness probing, testing, blending with his own desires and fears. It was intoxicating and terrifying. His mind expanded and fractured simultaneously, stretched across time and space, brushing against the lives of those who had died here, who had been bound to the chamber before him. He tried to pull away, to resist, but the chamber had no tolerance for weakness. "You are one with us now. There is no outside. There is only the pulse, only the valley, only the power." The words were not spoken, but understood, sinking into the marrow of his bones. Tobias felt his heart and mind synchronized with a rhythm older than human civilization, and with that synchronization came knowledge no mortal should possess. The cycles of life, death, dominance, and submission encoded into every stone, every root, every gust of wind. In the mirror of the valley's surface waters, Tobias saw reflections not his own. Faces emerged, shifting and changing, some human, some not, echoes of the chamber's ancient occupants. They watched him, judged him, and yet offered him a glimpse of what he could become. Tobias's own image blurred with theirs, his body no longer entirely his own, his thoughts a mesh of consciousness spanning millennia. And then he felt it, the first taste of true omniscience. He could sense the land itself, every insect, every rustle, every tremor in the soil. He could hear the river whispering secrets of those who had crossed its banks centuries ago. He could anticipate the path of birds in flight, the migration of animals, the subtle shifts of the wind. The chamber had not only connected him to the past, it had given him dominion over the present, insight into forces invisible to ordinary men. But this communion came with peril. Tobias could feel the chamber's will pressing against his own, testing the boundaries of autonomy. If he faltered, the ancient consciousness would consume him, folding him into itself as it had countless others. The whispers became a challenge, a ritual of dominance. Do you control us, or do we control you? Tobias smiled, a thin, calculating curve of lips. He did not yet fully understand the power coursing through him, but he knew he had tasted it, and it had tasted him. Fear, submission, mastery. These were no longer abstract concepts. They were tools, weapons, and chains all at once. The chamber had merged with him. He had become both pupil and master, observer and executioner. And as the sun dipped behind jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the valley floor, Tobias realized the first truth of his new existence. The valley did not merely obey, it judged, and judgment, he knew, was absolute. The chamber had begun to speak with a clarity that was almost unbearable. Tobias could no longer distinguish between his own thoughts and the ancient voice that now flowed through him. It was not a voice of sound, but of comprehension, a knowledge that demanded both reverence and fear. The secrets it revealed were older than recorded history, forbidden for any mortal to grasp. Truths buried beneath centuries of lies, myth, and religious dogma. The first revelation was the nature of power itself. Civilization, Tobias learned, had always been a structure built upon selective memory and controlled ignorance. Wars, politics, religions, they were instruments, meticulously designed by those who understood the deeper rhythms of human fear and ambition. These architects of society had long since learned that the masses could be manipulated through ritual, story, and the concealment of certain truths. And the chamber had recorded it all. The blueprints of dominance, the hierarchy of influence, the subtle mechanisms that made empires rise and fall. Next came the knowledge of rituals lost to time. Tobias saw visions of ceremonies conducted under moonless skies, where initiates were brought to thresholds of pain and ecstasy, testing the limits of body and mind. They were given choices, submission or annihilation, and only those capable of mastering fear and desire survived. These rituals were not superstition, they were education in the purest form of control, a method to awaken latent capacities and bind the participant to forces far beyond ordinary comprehension. Tobias felt the pull of each ritual, the echo of power in his veins. And then came the forbidden history, suppressed by institutions desperate to maintain control. Tobias saw civilizations erased, not through conquest alone, but through subtle rewrites of memory, books destroyed, bloodlines obscured, stories rewritten, and entire peoples had been marginalized, their knowledge buried, because the truths they carried threatened the fragile equilibrium of those in power. The chamber revealed names, dates, and events that contradicted everything known to history. It showed him the puppet strings stretched across time, pulling humanity toward outcomes meticulously designed by hidden hands. Tobias realized the gravity of what he had uncovered. He could choose to remain silent, as countless others had, disappearing into obscurity. Or he could wield this knowledge, bending it to his will, shaping reality in ways few could imagine. But with that choice came responsibility and danger. The chamber whispered warnings. Those who carried forbidden truths were hunted, not always by the living, but sometimes by the memory of those truths themselves. Reality had a way of enforcing balance, of demanding price for knowledge taken too eagerly. At that moment, Tobias understood the duality of power. Mastery over the world required mastery over oneself first. Fear, ambition, desire, and restraint were all levers, and only by understanding their exact weight could one manipulate the currents of reality. He felt the chamber's gaze, testing him, pressing him to prove he was worthy. Tobias knew he would have to act, to integrate these teachings into his being, or be consumed. The whispers coalesced into a single phrase, heavy with implication. Knowledge is the blade, will is the hand that wields it. Twice Tobias repeated the phrase aloud, allowing it to anchor in his consciousness. And as he spoke it, he felt the chamber's essence solidify within him, binding his identity to a force older than kingdoms, older than empires. He had become a vessel of forbidden knowledge. And there was no turning back. Tobias emerged from the chamber into the valley, with a purpose that was no longer entirely his own. The knowledge coursing through him now demanded action, and he understood that power untested was a danger to itself. The first test would be subtle, psychological, an exercise in control, perception, and manipulation. The valley had given him dominion over its whispers, over its shadows, over its very pulse. Now he would extend that dominion outward, testing the limits of fear, will, and obedience. From a distance, Tobias observed the remnants of the outsiders who had survived the initial encounter. They were disoriented, fractured, trembling, minds stretched thin by what they had witnessed. They did not yet realize that the valley's pulse was not just external, it had taken residence in Tobias himself. With a thought, he extended his influence, projecting not words, but intent. One man felt an irresistible compulsion to kneel, another froze in place as if the air itself had become heavier than his own body could bear. Tobias focused on the subtle mechanics of power, anticipation, restraint, suggestion. He had learned that the human mind responds more fully to invisible pressure than visible threat. He whispered a phrase into the currents of the valley, and it carried on the wind to the ears of the survivors, unheard yet understood. Obey or vanish. The phrase took root in their subconscious, growing like a shadow, pressing them toward submission without their awareness. He tested their resolve further, creating illusions that blurred the line between reality and hallucination. Trees bent impossibly, shadows stretched and danced in impossible patterns, and faint murmurs of ancient voices echoed around them. Panic rose, but Tobias did not push them into chaos. He guided it, like a conductor controlling the crescendo of an orchestra. Every movement, every gesture was calculated. Fear became an instrument, obedience the melody. And then Tobias allowed them a glimpse of true surrender. He projected the memory of the chamber, the pulse, the whispers of millennia. They saw not only what had happened, but what could happen to those who resisted. Lives fragmented, minds twisted, identities dissolved into the valley's rhythm. The survivors fell, some on their knees, others shaking uncontrollably, all now fully aware that they were in Tobias's sphere. The first test concluded not with violence, but with absolute psychological domination. Tobias had proven to himself and to the valley that his mastery was more than theoretical. He could bend perception, will, and instinct to his purpose. The chamber's knowledge was no longer dormant. It was alive in him, a living weapon capable of shaping minds, rewriting behavior, and enforcing obedience. He understood something crucial. Mastery was not about terror alone. It was about precision, patience, and subtlety. One could destroy instantly, or one could shape slowly, guiding the will of others without their awareness. Tobias smiled, a predator satisfied not by the kill, but by the knowledge that he had the power to command life itself. The valley hummed beneath him, acknowledging the first true act of dominance. Tobias was no longer a student. He was the executor, the arbiter, the wielder of forces forbidden to ordinary men. And the real tests were only beginning. Tobias moved through the valley like a shadow that carried authority rather than presence. The pulse of the chamber still resonated through him, each beat a reminder that the knowledge he had claimed was not passive. It demanded action, demanded influence. His first test had been small, a few scattered survivors, but now he sought to expand, to see how far the threads of obedience could stretch before breaking. The local villagers, simple people unfamiliar with the valley's hidden rhythm, were his next experiment. They went about their lives, unaware of the invisible current creeping toward them. Tobias began subtly, a glance that lingered too long, a word spoken with an accent of command, the faintest suggestion planted in conversation. Minds responded before consciousness did, hesitation before recognition. Slowly, inexorably, the villagers' behavior began to bend, like iron shaped by fire. He discovered that fear alone was insufficient. Obedience required a blend of allure and dread, a combination of promise and threat that penetrated deeper than force. Tobias learned to modulate the pulse within himself, radiating dominance in waves, guiding decisions, nudging perceptions, tilting reality just enough that free will became a slippery illusion. A man who had refused his presence now swept the valley paths clean, unaware why he moved so dutifully. A woman who had been skeptical began performing tasks Tobias had never asked, driven by subtle compulsions embedded in the currents of his influence. But mastery was not total without resistance. Tobias encountered defiance, small sparks of rebellion that flared in minds unwilling to surrender completely. And in those sparks, he found the key to amplification. Resistance, he realized, could be transformed into obedience if approached correctly. He used a mixture of exposure, ritualized demonstration, and psychological prowess. Sure, folding their defiance into his will, the stronger the initial opposition, the more absolute the submission once broken. The valley became a theater of subtle domination. Tobias watched entire groups act in synchronized obedience, unaware that their movements were choreographed by a mind they could not see. Even natural elements seemed to respond. The wind shifted when he walked. Shadows deepened at his command. The river's murmur seemed to echo his intent. Every human interaction, every act of compliance reinforced the pulse that now ran through the valley and through him. At night, Tobias would walk among them, observing without interference, noting the minutiae of thought, the pattern of decision, the exact weight at which obedience tipped. Twice he had them repeat the symbolic phrase that bound their minds. Knowledge is the blade, will is the hand that wields it. Each repetition cemented identity, allegiance, and transformation. He had now created more than followers. He had begun crafting extensions of his own will. By the time the moon rose high, Tobias understood the terrifying scope of what he could achieve. The valley's pulse was no longer just a force of history or hidden knowledge. It had become a living conduit for his control, an amplifier of human potential and human submission. He was no longer testing mastery, he was actively shaping it, bending reality in ways that defied conventional morality and reason. And the descent had only just begun. Tobias had learned that control over individuals was powerful, but the manipulation of memory, perception, and collective belief, that was dominion on an entirely different scale. The valley had taught him a secret older than kingdoms. History was not merely a record of events. It was a living construct, shaped by those who understood the hidden currents of influence. To control the present, one must first control the past. He began subtly, first by observing patterns in villagers' recollections of events, small discrepancies, contradictions, forgotten details. These were cracks through which influence could seep. Tobias learned to plant suggestions in casual conversation, in the recounting of mundane events, so that when memories resurfaced, they carried new details, new interpretations, all reinforcing his authority. A child recalled seeing a mysterious figure in the forest that was never there. An elder insisted a past conflict had resolved differently than remembered. Each shift, imperceptible to the untrained mind, was a brick in the fortress of control. Tobias moved to grander manipulations. He recreated events, staged incidents that appeared spontaneous but were meticulously orchestrated, fires that never burned homes, shadows that never moved on their own, messages discovered in places carefully chosen, all reinforced the perception that the valley and its unseen forces were real, omnipresent, and inevitable. Fear and awe became inseparable companions, shaping behavior without direct confrontation. But the true mastery came in collective belief. Tobias orchestrated stories passed from one person to another, rumors that mutated like viruses, yet always aligned with the pulse of his will. Villagers began recounting tales that Tobias had implanted, altering family histories, legends, even their understanding of the land itself. Over weeks, months, the valley became enshrined in a narrative only he fully understood. A history rewritten silently, imperceptibly, by the one who wielded forbidden knowledge. He watched as resistance diminished. Those who had doubted now questioned their own recollection of reality. Tobias had achieved a dangerous equilibrium, obedience maintained not by visible threat, but by internalized belief. Minds no longer needed to be coerced. They surrendered willingly, convinced that the patterns, the legends, and the terrors they experienced were inevitable, immutable. The valley existed as both physical place and psychological dominion, inseparable from the histories that Tobias controlled. Twice more he instructed key figures to repeat the symbolic phrase, "Knowledge is the blade, will is the hand that wields it." Each repetition engraved obedience, identity, and allegiance deeper into the psyche. Tobias understood now that mastery was as much about shaping thought as commanding action. The valley itself became an extension of his mind, a conduit for influence across generations. And yet, in the depths of control, Tobias felt the pull of even darker possibilities. History could be bent, yes, but what if he could rewrite the perception of time itself? What if memory, legend, and truth could be fused into a single force of influence, a manipulation so complete that reality itself would appear as an artifact of his will? The valley had already begun to obey, but the experiment was far from over. Tobias understood that the valley, for all its potency, was a confined dominion. True mastery demanded expansion. The pulse, once localized, could reach farther, influence others who had never set foot in the shadowed depths he now commanded. He began to weave a network, a lattice of obedience and influence that spread silently, invisibly, like roots beneath the earth. Each node of this network was human, unassuming, and unaware that their actions, beliefs, and decisions were now subtly dictated by a force they could neither see nor resist. He selected his emissaries carefully, not the strongest or most intelligent, but those whose minds were pliable, whose ambitions could be aligned with subtle suggestion. Tobias had learned from his valley experiments. Influence works best when it is not forced, but cultivated, nurtured, and almost imperceptible. Through letters, casual encounters, rumors, and orchestrated coincidences, he implanted ideas that seemed self-originated. Communities far beyond the valley began to act in ways that converged perfectly with Tobias's unseen design. With each interaction, Tobias observed the mechanics of submission. One village cultivated certain crops at his unspoken suggestion. A distant town began celebrating festivals he had invented in memory alone. Alliances formed, feuds simmered, and yet all patterns were perfectly predictable because he had aligned the beliefs driving them. The valley's pulse had become an invisible engine, and the network of influence extended across miles, shaping destinies without overt command. He did not need to be present to enforce compliance. The psychological threads he had woven were stronger than any visible authority. Even skeptics, faced with inexplicable coincidences, began to doubt their own judgment. Each subtle nudge, each carefully planted story, tightened his control. Tobias had discovered the refining truth. When minds are guided subtly without awareness, the obedience becomes permanent, unquestionable, and self-reinforcing. At the heart of this network, Tobias introduced symbolic rituals, phrases, and gestures. Twice he instructed his most trusted intermediaries to recite the line, "Knowledge is the blade, will is the hand that wields it," not just as a mantra, but as a signal, a binding of identity, a trigger for allegiance, a thread linking minds across distance. Those who participated unknowingly transmitted influence further, becoming carriers of the valley's pulse, of Tobias's will, and of the forbidden knowledge he now embodied. By the time the first generation of intermediaries had internalized the mandate, Tobias's dominion had transcended geography. Entire communities were unknowingly aligned, their lives subtly reshaped, their choices preordained. The valley was no longer the source of power, it was merely the seedbed. His reach was now a lattice of invisible obedience, a shadow empire maintained by psychology, perception, and fear. And yet, Tobias sensed a deeper potential. If he could connect more nodes, more minds, if he could extend the network across kingdoms and generations, he would no longer merely influence events, he could dictate the course of history itself, shaping reality to the rhythm of his will. The experiment had become inevitable. The network was rising, and Tobias was poised at the center, the unseen arbiter of destinies. The valley no longer resembled the place Tobias had first entered. It had become a living entity, a nexus of influence where memory, perception, and reality converged under his control. Every stone, every tree, every shadow seemed to pulse with his will. The human network he had cultivated beyond its borders now fed back into it, amplifying the pulse, reinforcing obedience, and expanding the boundaries of his dominion. What had begun as subtle manipulation of individuals had evolved into something far greater, a complete self-sustaining system of control, a living testament to forbidden knowledge. Tobias walked through the valley at twilight, observing the culmination of his work. Villagers moved in perfect harmony, performing tasks that no one could fully explain. Legends they whispered aligned precisely with the history he had rewritten, and the symbolic phrase, "Knowledge is the blade, will is the hand that wields it," echoed silently in countless minds, binding allegiance across miles and generations. Even the natural world seemed to acknowledge his dominion. The river shifted its course subtly, the wind bent to his passage, shadows deepened, as if in reverence. Every component of this ecosystem had become an extension of Tobias's intent, an instrument of his authority. He realized, with a cold clarity, that his work was no longer about controlling people. It was about controlling reality itself. The valley was both laboratory and throne, the network of influence an invisible spine linking countless minds, time, history, memory. They all bent beneath the weight of his orchestration. Individuals no longer acted independently. They acted as conduits of his will, their decisions, beliefs, and memories flowing into a single, unbroken current. He had become both god and architect of this microcosm, shaping not just behavior, but the very perception of existence. Yet, too, Tobias understood the delicate balance. Absolute dominion required constant maintenance, subtle calibration of influence to prevent cracks in obedience. Twice more he commanded key intermediaries to repeat the symbolic phrase. Each repetition not only reinforced allegiance, it fused identity with his design, ensuring that the network would remain intact even if he were absent. Minds that had once resisted or wavered now embraced their role as carriers of the pulse, their will indistinguishable from his own. The final transformation was complete when Tobias observed that even outsiders, those untouched directly by his manipulation, were subtly influenced by the ripple of the valley's presence. The network had extended beyond intention, a force propagating through observation, rumor, and subtle psychological resonance. What had begun as an experiment in control had become a self-perpetuating system of obedience, a living manifestation of forbidden knowledge, and a testament to the power that comes from understanding the hidden currents of the world. Tobias smiled, knowing the descent into mastery had reached its apex. The valley, once a secret, now existed as both crucible and cathedral of human influence, a dark legacy that would endure long after memory of him faded. But even as he contemplated this terrifying achievement, he understood a deeper truth. The experiment was never truly over. Reality itself was pliable, and the pulse, the network, the valley, the minds, remained a tool to reshape it in ways the world would never comprehend. The forbidden had become inevitable, and Tobias, its silent arbiter, had become eternal. The culmination of Tobias's work was not an event witnessed by crowds or recorded in any ledger. It was invisible, omnipresent, a quiet domination that reshaped reality itself. Generations would pass, and yet the pulse, the network, the valley, the minds it controlled, would continue its silent orchestration. Tobias had achieved what no ruler, no king, no institution could ever manage, a dominion not over territories or armies, but over thought, memory, and perception itself. He had become the unseen hand, shaping events, decisions, and destinies without the world ever realizing it. Across valleys, villages, towns, and even distant cities, subtle patterns emerged. Decisions that seemed spontaneous were not. Alliances, rivalries, discoveries, and failures, all were subtly guided to serve the architecture Tobias had constructed. Scholars would debate causes, historians would search for explanations, yet none would glimpse the truth. The fabric of reality had been threaded with influence so delicate, so precise, that it appeared natural. And yet every ripple, every outcome, traced back to the pulse of the valley and its master. Those who came into direct contact with Tobias's teachings, those who had repeated the symbolic phrase, "Knowledge is the blade, will is the hand that wields it," understood something others could never grasp. Their thoughts carried dual currents, conscious intention, and the invisible guidance of the network. They were conduits, not pawns, but willing vessels for influence that transcended generations. Tobias had forged a system where allegiance was internalized, desire aligned with his design, and resistance dissolved before it could even form. And yet the true terror and the true power lay in the impossibility of detecting it. A society, a civilization, could be directed without realizing it. Wars could be avoided or provoked, discoveries delayed or accelerated, economies manipulated, cultures reshaped. Tobias's influence flowed like a hidden river beneath the surface of existence, imperceptible but unstoppable. The valley was no longer merely a location, it was a principle, a methodology of domination through subtlety, precision, and the shaping of thought itself. He understood the final truth. Knowledge was power, but power without the comprehension of its consequences was dangerous even to its wielder. The forbidden knowledge he had mastered did not merely change events. It changed people, altered perceptions, and reframed history itself. And in the deepest silence of the valley, Tobias saw that this system could endure, adapt, and expand long after his own presence faded. It was eternal, invisible, and unstoppable. As you listen now, remember this. The forces that shape your world are rarely visible. The patterns that influence your thoughts, your choices, your very understanding of reality, many are guided by unseen hands. The valley, Tobias, and the network exist as a warning, a lesson, and an invitation. Those who perceive the pulse may choose to harness it or be consumed by it. Knowledge is the blade. Will is the hand that wields it. The hidden currents of history are alive, and now you have seen them.